Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to thank everyone who invited me and made it possible to come talk to you all about all kinds of interesting things, which, coming from a liberal arts college as I do, it's just a neat opportunity for me to interact with people with these types of interests. So as the title of this talk implies, there's a debate out there, and it's mostly a debate among scholars, but it's not just a debate among scholars. Some policymakers have also been involved in this debate as well. And the debate is about the topic of what is the best way to end a civil war. On the one hand, we have the rather provocatively titled "Let It Burn" school here. And this is sort of associated with the work of Robert Lutwak. And let it burn, by that I mean, essentially the argument is that civil wars should be allowed to burn themselves out, that essentially outside actors should not intervene, that the parties involved should fight it out to the finish and see which one wins. And then the other argument about the best way to end civil wars is that there should be a negotiated end to these civil wars. Now, the average person might find this debate rather shocking. So, for example, when my student says, "What are you going to go talk about?" I said, "The best way to end civil wars." And, what? There's more than one way? Shouldn't we just stop them? And, again, they were reacting to this thought that the international community should do all it can to help end suffering, that wars bring in their wake, civil wars bring in their wakes, death, rape, destruction of infrastructure, and wouldn't it be the best thing to stop this as soon as possible so the country can get on its road to recovery? So just to be clear, this debate about the best way to end a civil war is actually has a very specific part to it, which is what is the best way to end a civil war if one wants to ensure that the peace will be stable? So in other words, it's not normatively what is the best way to end a civil war, but what is the best way to end a civil war if what we want to do is to ensure that the war doesn't break back out again, that the parties don't just have a short peace and return to war again. All right, so that is at the heart of this argument about the best way to end a civil war. So there are these two schools of thought, then, that I'm going to talk about. And I want to start by making an argument that, interestingly enough, these two schools of thought do agree on one thing. And that is that if the peace is going to be stable after a civil war, right, if peace is going to endure, the war-ending settlement or agreement, whether that settlement or agreement, I'm going to use those words interchangeably, whether it's achieved via military victory or negotiation, has to reduce uncertainty among the actors and stabilize expectations. Let's see, I want to actually move forward a slide here. Okay. This argument about the importance of reducing uncertainty and stabilizing actors' expectations is drawn from the rationalist approach to the study of war, and this approach is associated with the work of people like James Fearon, for example, Dan Ryder, Suzanne Werner, so just to mention some political scientists. And this rationalist approach to the study of war argues that wars will only end when the parties to the conflict arrive at a bargain that they prefer to ongoing war. And in keeping with that the peace will only last as long as the groups remain committed to the new bargain. So, it's, again, very much out of this rational actor school of thought. Okay, so both schools of thought here, both contending arguments here, do agree that peace should remain stable as long as the rival groups, as long as the groups that were fighting each other have the same expectations regarding the outcome of any future hypothetical war they might fight. All right, so that if they both have the same expectation that were they to return to conflict, if they both agree that Party X is going to win next time, or Party Y, as long as Party X doesn't believe it's going to win, and Party Y believes it's going to win. So I'll repeat that again, as long as the rival groups have the same expectations regarding the outcome of any future hypothetical war they might fight, then the peace should remain stable. So both the Let It Burn and the bargaining school, both the let it burn and the negotiate an end to civil war agree on that much. All right, they agree on that. Where the two schools part company is on how this expectation on the part of armed adversaries can best be fostered. So how can you get them to have, to essentially believe that if they were to fight any future civil war, that they both have the same expectation about what the outcome is going to be. So what I'm going to do is go over what each school of thought argues is the best way to foster that expectation. And again, the notion is if they have the same expectation, that the agreement will prove stable. Okay? So let me start with the let it burn school of thought. Starting with the starting with the argument that the let it burn or the military victory school of thought makes, the argument in this case is that military victories make for a more durable peace. In other words, military victories wars should be allowed to play themselves out until one party finally wins. Because it's argued military victories result in the destruction of the organizational identities of all the factions that fight in the Civil War, with the exception of the winner. Okay, so that's the underlying premise here, that military victories are going to produce a more stable peace because the organizational identities or the organizational structures of all the factions that fight in the Civil War, except obviously the winning faction, are going to be destroyed. All right. And the notion here is that the victorious side then takes advantage of the superior strength that allowed it to win the Civil War and uses that strength to destroy or dismantle the organizations of their adversaries in order to prevent any future armed challenges to their own power. And I want to be clear about something. This doesn't mean genocide. This argument doesn't say that the victor obliterates its opponents, right? It's very specific. It says that the victor destroys the organizational structures of the groups that fought against it. And again, with the goal of ensuring that they're not going to be able to come back and fight again. Okay? So the thought is that groups that can no longer carry out a vital set of organizational functions, and those include, and I'll elaborate on this a little bit later again, but among those functions are a leadership function, communication and coordination, and or recruitment or replacement of their members. So groups that can't carry out those organizational functions anymore, they're thought to be unlikely to resume armed conflict. So in effect, by destroying the loser's organizational structures, the winner leaves its opponents with little doubt regarding the outcome of any future military encounters. The losers will lose. All right, and the winner has essentially demonstrated that, it's argued, by using its strength to dismantle the organizational structures of the losers. What all this boils down to for the let it burn school of thought is that the losers are thought to be more likely to stick to whatever settlement terms are agreed to at the end of the war, since they are unlikely to believe they can achieve a better deal for themselves in the future by resorting to the use of force again. So since they won't believe that, they won't believe that this stabilizes expectations. The losers expect that in any future encounter, they'll lose again. The victors expect that they will win again. Why? Because they've demonstrated their strength, and they've demonstrated it decisively to the point where they could dismantle the organizations of the losing factions. So let me turn now to the other school of thought, the negotiated settlement school of thought. This settlement takes a very different tack, and it argues that actors' expectations can be stabilized and uncertainty can be reduced in instances where groups are not defeated and they are allowed to retain their organizational identity. So how can this be done? And through the use of power-sharing measures, essentially. And these power-sharing measures, then, are ones that call for the distribution of political or territorial or military power among the rival groups at the end of the war per terms, whatever terms they agree to as part of a negotiated settlement. And this school of thought argues that the way in which these measures can help stabilize the peace are three somewhat interrelated factors, or two and another one. These measures help stabilize the peace, first of all, by giving rivals a stake in the future in the form of access to state power. So they have a stake in the future of the state, and with that stake, they're less likely to threaten that by going back to war again. Here the thinking is that power-sharing measures actually do alter rival groups' preferences, but in a way that helps to stabilize the peace. And that's something that I argue that the rationalist school doesn't really allow for. It does talk about the fact that actors can revise their expectations, and then they can revise their preferences, but the assumption always seems to be that if they revise their preferences, it's going to be in a way that leads to war. My argument is power sharing could actually lead them to revise their preferences in a way that actually helps stabilize the peace, which is just as possible, I think, a theoretical possibility as the argument that revised expectations are always going to be in a direction that leads you to war. And then finally, power-sharing provisions can also make it difficult for rival forces to return to armed conflict, especially if they've employed military power-sharing measures. And in this instance, I'm talking about agreements, for example, that call for blending the forces of the government and the forces of the rebel groups so that they're integrated into the state's armed forces. If you blend these together, it makes it much harder than to see a return to conflict. So, those are the two sides' arguments. Which school of thought does historical evidence support? Let me turn to another slide here. What I argue is that efforts to test this argument have been problematic for three important reasons. All right, so again, you have this argument by the Let It Burn school of thought. You have an argument on the negotiated settlement school of thought, but I argue that it really hasn't fully been tested for three sets of reasons. First of all, the first bullet up there, remember that the argument both schools have in common is that it's settlements, and I don't mean negotiated settlements by that. I mean that every war ends in a settlement. Even if it's a military victory by one side, there's some sort of war-ending agreement. Okay? So first of all, remember that the argument that they both have in common is that it is settlements that reduce uncertainty and the settlements that reduce uncertainty and stabilize expectations that will be stable. Okay? But in fact, efforts to test this argument have relied on war outcomes. All right? So people haven't been using what the terms agreed to are as a way to test this. They've been focusing instead on war outcomes. And by that I mean, i.e., whether the war either ended in a military victory or it ended in a negotiated settlement. That's what they've used as a proxy or as a way of testing this argument. And my point is that this is problematic because war outcomes and war settlements are not necessarily the same thing. Okay? And again, but political scientists have been acting as though they were, or have been glossing over the potential difference between them and saying, well, we'll just take war outcomes because that's easy to, we know, did a war end in a military victory or did it end in a negotiated settlement? We don't know what all the terms are necessarily, so we'll just plug that in instead. Okay? Settlements essentially determine who gets what at a war's end. Outcomes describe the way the war ended. So they're not necessarily the same thing. Another problem with efforts to test this in the past has been that the military victory, the Let It Burn school, makes an assumption that we haven't actually had any empirical evidence for. And that assumption is they've just assumed that military victories do lead to the destruction of the losing faction's organizational structures. So they've said, well, so we believe that, so we'll just use military victories. All right? And I argue, well, that's actually an empirical question. We don't know that. Are they? Do they always? I don't know. Third, the negotiated settlement school of thought has also made an assumption that's problematic, and that's that agreement by adversaries to share some form of power only happens after negotiated settlements of civil war. And the logic there has been, well, if someone won a military victory, why would they even agree to share power with the losers? I mean, that's generally been assumed. I'm guilty of having assumed that, for example. But it is, again, possible that victors might adopt a strategy of prudence in victory, as Maus calls it. So maybe they will extend some form of power-sharing measures, agreements to the losers in a civil war. Again, it's a question that deserves actual investigation, not just, we shouldn't just assume that. By the way, most of the tests that exist that have used negotiated settlement and military victory as the measures or proxies for testing the larger argument here have found that military victories produce a more stable peace. So the evidence seems to stack up in favor of military victories, although there are a few studies that either find no relationship between how the war ends and stability of peace, and a very few that have found that negotiated settlements actually make for a more durable peace when you look at both of these types. But mostly, and then Monica Duffy Toft has a brand new book out, just out this month, that again makes this argument that military victories make for a more durable peace. As you'll see in a couple minutes, I find something different than that. I don't support the argument that it's military victories that make for a more durable peace, and I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about why I think I found that compared to what other people have found, if you want to follow up on that. So all of this is just basically by way of giving you some background on the kind of the state of arguments regarding what the best way is of ending civil wars. And with that as background, then let me say what I did with this particular project. What I decided to try to do is to actually test the actual heart of each of the arguments that each of the schools make. In effect, I deconstruct the two schools of thought's arguments regarding the best way to end civil wars. And by doing that, I came up with three sets of hypotheses then that I want to test regarding the bigger argument here about the best way to end a civil war. The first one says, okay, well, let's do what everyone else has done and look at military victories and look at negotiated settlements and see whether one. So let's focus on outcomes, right? And so my hypothesis, following along with, again, the major argument in the literature, this is people that Wagner and Roy Licklider and a whole series of people have made this argument that civil wars that end in a military victory are going to be followed by a more durable peace than conflicts that end through negotiation. So I do test outcomes, all right, and see if they make any difference for the duration of the peace. A second hypothesis then, and this is where I'm actually now testing the let it burns, the real heart of their argument. Peace will prove more durable when rival factions, organizational structures are destroyed at the end of civil wars. All right, so let's see. This is essentially, if settlements are determined who gets what, this is the who part. Who's allowed to survive? Who is an actual then party in the peace? And the third hypothesis I test, this one then is for the negotiated settlement school of thought. Peace will endure longer when rival factions agree to construct an array of power-sharing measures at a civil war end. This is a hypothesis I focused it on before, only for negotiated settlements, but now I'm saying let's look at it for all civil wars, okay, and see whether anything changes with respect to that. Okay, and really quickly in the next slide, I just, again, make clear what I mean by terms of settlement. So I'm going to look at outcomes and terms of settlements. Who gets what, what are the factions that survive the end of the war, gets what access to elements of state power. Okay, so in order to test these hypotheses then, I needed to do two things. There's already data on, did a conflict end in a military victory or did a conflict end in a negotiated settlement? So I already had the outcomes data. But basically, I needed to do something to be able to test. I needed to collect data to be able to test the other two hypotheses. So The first thing I needed to do was to determine, all right, what was the fate of factions at the end of civil wars? What happened to their organizational structures? And again, there was no data on that. Everyone had just been assuming military victory means everybody gets wiped out, everyone's structures get wiped out, but for the victors. So I decided to collect data on that. I did this for all civil wars that were fought and ended at some point between 1945 and 1999, which is a total of 108 civil wars. And I do use the more standard correlates of war definition of civil wars, so I don't drop down to the, say, 25, the PRIO type of definition of civil wars. So I have 108 civil wars, and just to be really brief about this, what I did was rank the fate of factions on a scale from 1, which if it was a 1, that faction's organizational structure was destroyed at the end of the Civil War. And what does that mean? It means key members of the leadership were destroyed, killed, or exiled, and no new effective leaders emerged. Or it could also mean that communication between leaders and followers was destroyed. Can't have much of an organization if leaders and followers can't communicate with one another. Or it might mean that the organization was unable to recruit new followers. So if any of those conditions held, I said that the organization was effectively destroyed and that faction got scored a 1. Just to give you a quick real-life example of what one of those is, I thought this one was one of the more unusual ones. Indonesia has had a number of civil wars. Its 1950 civil war was one which saw the leadership of the secessionist Republic of South Malacca exiled to the Netherlands. They literally were shipped off to the Netherlands, effectively separating the leadership from any potential followers. So that conflict was scored a 1. There were a few rare cases in which I scored the fate of factions as a 2. Those were very, very rare instances when factions actually chose to dismantle their own organizations at the end of a civil war. As you might imagine, that happens very rarely, but it does happen. And one example of that was the Movement for National and Social Liberation at the end of the Greek Civil War. It chose to dismantle itself as an organization. I coded the fate of factions as a 3 when the Civil War faction survived, but its ability to function was limited or altered in some way. An example of that was following the Iraqi Civil War of 1950. The government launched a campaign to destroy the Iraqi Communist Party. It didn't succeed, but it had enough of effect on it that it forced the latter to operate clandestinely. So it had to operate in a more limited manner. And then finally, I scored groups, factions of 4, meaning that their organizational structure was preserved. Examples of that would be Renamo following Mozambique Civil War, the FMLN following El Salvador Civil War. Both actually went on to become political parties, for example. So those are scored as factions whose organizational structure was preserved. I found a total of 358 factions for the 108 civil wars. Some civil wars had as few as 2 factions, which is, I think, how we typically think of a civil war, the government versus a rebel group. But some civil wars had many more factions. The highest was Lebanon's 1975 to 89 civil war, which had 11 factions. And then the last postscript on this is I tracked the factions for a period of 3 years following the end of the Civil War to see what happens to the organizational structures 3 years out after the end of the Civil War. The other thing I needed to do then to test another hypothesis was to go through all the civil wars to see whether any provisions to share power were agreed to at the war's end. I'd already done this for negotiated settlements and negotiated truces of civil war, so effectively that meant I just needed to do it for wars that ended in military victory, and so I did that too. So I coded all civil wars now for whether there was any power sharing. And just to give you a snapshot of what I found, this is just the what happens to the organizational structure of factions. I found that 103 of the, and actually this, I said I found 358 factions. I only have 352 a total of, I think, 352 in the end, because there were 6 factions I could not track at all. I found them in the war, and then I couldn't find anything about them after the war. But 103 did have their organizational structure destroyed. 11 chose to dismantle themselves, a very small number, obviously. 106 were altered in some fashion or limited in some fashion, their organizational structures. And 132 I scored as having had their organizational structures preserved. And again, another quick slide here. This is in case you wonder whether there's any relationship between Civil War outcomes and the fate of factions. A couple interesting things to point out about here are that, in fact, nearly 80% of the cases in which only one faction does maintain its organizational structure did see the war end via a military victory. But, and rather surprising, nearly 42%, that top column up there, nearly 42% of all wars that ended in military victory actually saw the preservation of the organizational structures of factions other than that of just the winner. So military victories did not always lead to the destruction of the winning faction's organizational structure. Finally,
you look at all into what effect potentially maybe the ethnic, religious, cultural, historical divides between the factions within might have on like whether it was more or less, if they were closer together with their identity to begin with, would it be more or less stable as peace?
So I have a variable that I call the issues at stake in the conflict, which rather crudely measures whether it's an identity conflict, language, ethnic, religion, or whether it's more an ideological or political type conflict. And I didn't include it in this final one, but I have used it.
It's not.
No.
Okay.
Although I'll admit it's a very crude variable, right?
Okay.
It's just a dummy variable saying it's an identity conflict or it's not. Instead of, there are ways, maybe I should have used like the EH, ethnic heterogeneity variable or something like that. But I didn't in this instance.
Okay.
But you could add it in and see what happens.
Okay.
So the point at the end that you mentioned that why some factions really destroyed don't get the signal, it's really interesting, and that makes me wonder too. I mean, the issue of weak states makes me wonder to what extent these settlements are really about power sharing or about stabilizing a regime and kind of empowering. And it goes back to the question that these settlements are elite driven and are very much, just at the very top of society. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the differentiation between, and if it's possible to differentiate between stabilization or a peace process and power sharing. And power sharing has this democratization, kind of feel to it.
Right.
But it seems that if they're elite driven and then the arrangements include power sharing, then you're kind of democratizing it and giving opportunities for factions to rise up, right? So it seems that there's different issues at stake. There's stabilization, there's power sharing, there's democratization. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Okay, so I'm trying to understand. You're separating or you're distinguishing stabilization. So you're saying that these agreements, in effect, they stabilize regimes, although they might bring to mean a new regime comes to power, right? But you're saying they're regime stabilizing rather than...
I mean, if you said that if the state is weaker, then the factions don't get the signal that they will lose, then it seems to get more to the question of power sharing, but to the question of regime stability and state strength, right? Mm-hmm. And maybe gets to the question of course, of apparatus strength or whatever it is about that state strength. So to what extent are these successes or the durability of peace about state strength and about stability and really enforcing kind of the elites to have control, or is it about power sharing? Because there seems to be contradictory.
Right. If you focus on military victories, and that's where the argument about they're not getting the signal is, right? So say one group wins, right, and it's in power and it makes the rules, etc. And most often the thought is and this is an important question. So I'm just talking about one dependent variable, stabilizing the piece. I'm not even talking about how nice that piece looks or not. I'm just talking about, so there are normative issues associated with my focus on that dependent variable, right? The piece might be stable. They don't go back to war. Well, what if it's a really quote-unquote ugly piece, right? What if that's a piece that, we have either outcome here, right? What if it's a piece via military victory and it doesn't go back to war, but the regime in power now persecutes its enemies in other ways, short of killing them, but it imprisons them all or something. So you could have human rights abuses associated with this stable peace. You could have, it's not, depending on, I think typically the argument is that power sharing is sort of proto-democratic. It has elements of democracy because you're having several groups participate in the process, and the fear sometimes is that military victories are just going to lead to an autocratic and authoritarian regime, the winner, and then it'll exclude everyone else. But power sharing agreements, because they are elite driven and everything, also don't kind of fit our Western-centric model of what democracy is in many ways either. So I think, so just by focusing on the stability issue, let's see, there are several parts to this. I think state strength is something that probably deserves more of a focus and really that I haven't seen included in any of these efforts to look at this issue. I think my tendency would be to think that power sharing gets used more in the weaker state context because the notion is if it were a strong state, it could win, right? But what I'm saying is in the context in which these civil wars take place, how many of these really are strong states? So even when someone wins, we can't make the assumption that it's a strong state. I'm not sure I'm really getting at all the parts of your question there, but do you want to follow up? I mean,
no.
Okay.
How long do you take out the time? I know you said the time frame is 3 years out after the Civil War to look at the fate of the faction.
Right. But how long do I look at the duration of the peace?
Yeah.
The model stops essentially December 31st, 1999. So some settlements, like Costa Rica's 1948 Civil War, last all the way to that period of time. And then they're what we call censored in terms of this. So my censoring point is December 31st, 1999. So that's as far. Right now I'm trying to extend my data set because that's 10 years ago. So I'm trying to extend it to 2007 at this point. But the model accounts for what we call censoring as well. So essentially, pardon? This here with your it's only I don't. So I'm saying that it's right censored but not left censored, right? So fate of factions I only trace out 3 years, and I'd love to be able actually to trace that out as long as I look at the duration of the piece. But this was already a huge endeavor to look, identify all the factions and then track them even for 3 years. Again, as I said, I lost 6 of them. I just couldn't find them anywhere.
And you didn't group them with the destroyed?
No, I just let them drop out. No. That's not too many out of them.
No, actually, it's very
I saw somebody's hand in them.
I wanted to ask you about the Afghanistan war. Some people are calling it the 30-year civil war. I don't know what your take on it is. And during your research, when you were analyzing Afghanistan, how did you analyze it as a civil war? When did it begin? When did it end? And then did it restart again? Or do you agree with what a lot of people say that it's a 30-year civil war?
So, because this data set ends December 31st, 1999, there were, at that time, 14 cases of ongoing civil war, and they have to be dumped out, so I had 122, because I can't use a civil war if it didn't have an ending point at some point. Afghanistan does appear because it's had more than one episode of civil war, but the latest episode doesn't appear in here, because it can't be ongoing for me to analyze it.
So you include every episode as independent observation?
Okay, so this is a good question. And this is why I said earlier, why do I think I get a different military outcomes and negotiated settlements? Both have a positive, both sets of outcomes have an effect. And I think that's because what other people have done in the past is look at a country, so the unit of analysis, right? Look at a civil war, it stops. Then if the country has another civil war, they code that first episode as a peace having ended. But my argument is, if you're going to test this notion about the factions being destroyed, right, and whether that has an impact or not on here, you have to be fair. Then let me rephrase this. Let me kind of use my own language in a kind of better way. Essentially, what I argue is that I'll just read this. Distinguishing between new wars and renewed civil wars on the basis of whether or not the factions were previously involved in fighting a civil war in the country in question is necessary in order to test the theory that the fate of factions has an impact on the duration of the peace. So what happens is countries like Indonesia have had various civil wars, but many of them are between totally new factions, right? So what I say is if the country had a civil war between factions, let's say X and Y, right? And then that civil war ended, and those factions that never went back to war again, then that remains at peace, right? We have to assume that, or else we can't really test what impact does the fate of factions have on civil wars. Even though the country might have a new civil war, but if it's a totally different civil war with totally different sets of actors, I don't say that the previous peace failed.
So basically, so if there's a list of every single unit has, we can assume that has different factions, right? So it's a different in your analysis. So every observation is
no. Well, so Angola though has repeated, has the civil war start. And at one time, there was also Holden Roberto's group, but essentially it boils down to several of those episodes are between the MPLA and UNITA. So in those cases, when the MPLA and UNITA go back to war again after one of the failed settlements, I code that as the peace failed. The previous peace failed because the same factions did go back to war again. So I start over with a new conflict. The peace failed, I start over with a new conflict between them. Is that?
So what if at least one of the actors began fighting a new actor, or like in the case of Sierra Leone, I understand that like some of the actors would leave Sierra Leone and be fighting in a different area against the same kind of people, and then back into. I mean, at least that's part of it. So I mean, if they weren't. Is it still technically civil war?
So by definition, a civil war has to involve the government and some challenging faction, right? So if the government fights faction A and that civil war ends, and then years later the government fights some new faction Z, that's a different civil war. Yes, that country's had another civil war, but the first peace still endures because it's not between whoever I said it was, the government and actor A. It's a new war between the government and actor C. I think that it would be appropriate. So my argument is it would be appropriate if your question was the following, and this is something Barbara Walter has kind of looked at. If your question is, does the outcome of a previous civil war have an effect on whether or not new actors dare to challenge, right? Then it's fair to say, all right, this is where the peace stopped because a new civil war broke out. But that's a different question, right? It's about the effects of It's sort of a demonstration effect model. So if sorry.
But following up on that, if we assume that structural factors do have an impact, that even if the factions are different, the fact that there was civil war, and if we assume that, I don't know, certain economic or the issue of weak states have an impact, then you can change factions, but you have the same environment. So there is some.
Right. So I do try to control for those factors, right? I had in the previous Civil War, the conflict history was one of the variables I control for, level of economic development. I mean, I tap into as many of the structural variables as I can.
So it narrows down to the
yeah. So I'm trying to control for that across the country over time, no matter what civil war it's having. Rather crudely in some instances, again, but I can try to.
It might be a really easy question, but when you find that both military victories and negotiated settlements increase the durability of peace, what exactly does that mean?
You looked at it again, right? The omitted category is negotiated truces.
Okay.
So in the book that Matt and I wrote, we talk about 3 different ways, and some people are even going to maybe 4 different ways now. I'm not quite sure about that, but 3 different ways that civil wars can end. They can end through military victory. That's one possible outcome. Another outcome is a negotiated settlement, which I have a very definite definition for. And another one is a negotiated truce, which isn't a full settlement, but sort of freezes a conflict. An example of that is Morocco, in Western Sahara. It's not a negotiated settlement. It's essentially kind of a frozen thing that they just arrested a Danish diplomat or something in the last week. Morocco did, because he was found passing papers I forget the name of the Western Sahara group, but he was found passing certain kinds of documents to them. So it's still a conflict. I mean, they still are reacting to it, but it's a frozen conflict around this truce where they're still waiting for the UN to do this referendum that was promised over a decade ago.
So the coefficients, I don't know the Hartzell model at all, so I was just reading works that include it, but the coefficients for saying that military victory and negotiated settlements increase the durability of pieces compared to negotiated truces. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, because you have to have an omitted category. So for all of these, it's some form of, it's essentially something like that, negotiated truces. When you put both variables in. What I didn't show you is I also looked at this for just military victories and just negotiated settlements as well. And there, again, destroying the organizational structures of factions doesn't have a significant effect in either of those models, looking just at one type of conflict, looking just at the other type. Sorry, looking at one type of outcome, looking at the other type of outcome.
I'm trying to think about going through findings that you have for the civil wars, whether this also holds up for international outcomes. And to some extent, you've said a few times, that we shouldn't be trying to make these comparisons. But in a way, particularly your argument about how the losing side may not necessarily see the other side as so powerful, and that works also in the international context of third parties who empower the losers on the so-called losing side, and they become the winners. The ways in which military victory and negotiated settlement may both have commonalities and lead to similarities. So, do you see any important differences here? Can this be broadened out in the ways to end war, not just civil war, but
that's funny. I hadn't made the connection back the other way. I had just made the connection to saying we who study civil war borrowed a lot of our baggage, if you want to say that, our theoretical baggage from the interstate war literature, and I think it's taken us some distance, but at some point I think it becomes a handicap or something that we need to be aware of, the ways in which civil wars are different from interstate wars. I think at the end of the day, one of the things that I'm just struck by is at the end of the day, in interstate wars, they each retreat to their own bordered territories where, juridically, at least, they have sovereignty. And, you know, at the end of the day, in a civil war, you can have territorial autonomy and stuff, but they're still...
You can't really go anywhere.
Right.
You have to
Right. And
continue to interact.
right. And I think that that's just an important difference we really have to grapple with. That, for me, is one of the more interesting things about thinking this puzzle through. Is I've always wanted to sort of write a perspectives on politics type article about, okay, let's look at this rationalist model and let's look at the ways in which it takes us so far with this far with the analysis of civil war, but then let's look at the ways in which it might be problematic and civil wars are different. But I think right now it would be a 2-sentence article. So. It would be a 2-sentence article. There it is. Here's my whole argument.
Maybe I'll just ask, those your measures, I thought it was interesting that your three-pronged measurement scheme to see whether leadership has been dissolved or destroyed, communication, and then the ability to recruit. All seem to me, and I haven't read your piece, so I apologize, but as kind of independently sufficient conditions for then you coding them into some sort of incidents. And I'm wondering if there is certain of these conditions that tend to pair up more
That's
with
more
certain
important.
kinds of, like if, for instance, your leadership measurements end up correlating more with how organizations survive, or some other combination, it might be interesting because it doesn't seem like your scheme is like a sufficiency scheme. It's just like all these.
Right. I say this or this or
Right,
this
right.
or all of them. There could
Right.
be. I like your question. I'm going to write it down so I remember it. And the answer is I didn't look at that at all. In fact, for me, the coding of that variable was the biggest struggle of this paper. Not just the doing of it, how much time it took and everything, but the conceptualizing of it. And I'll just say that because it's Wagner who makes this big argument in this edited volume by Roy Linkleiter years ago, where he uses the phrase, destruction of the organizational structure of, rival groups. And I thought, and then, okay, but what does that mean? And it's taken me a long time to try to tease that out. If you look carefully at what he writes, it doesn't mean for him that that their war-making capability is destroyed. Interestingly, right? He says no. As long as they exist as an organization, they can come back to fight. They may be motivated to come back to fight a certain day. And I actually think that nowadays, especially with diasporas and the easy availability of arms and everything, the fact of having your military capability wiped out or impaired isn't that big a factor. If you continue to exist as an organization and the all the Tamils in Canada are sending you money, you can buy arms, especially in the post, Soviet world of arms floating.